Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining me during what I know is a very busy time of the academic year for everyone. So I do want to thank you. I just want to go over a few things before we actually start the webinar. So one, this is being recorded, and I'm really excited because I just figured out how to stop all those beeps when everybody enters and leaves the room. So one, this session will be recorded. Two, I have everybody on mute, but if you have a question at any point in time, just go ahead and type that in the chat box. Because I'm doing this alone today and don't have a member of my team, I won't be able to check that chat until the end. So hopefully everybody hears me well. If not, I will be sending the training materials to everyone. So you get the actual PowerPoint. You'll get a certificate indicating that you participated in the training. I know a lot of times people want to know about continuing education credit. So you will, it won't say it's a continuing education credit, but it will say that you participated in this webinar today. You'll get the PowerPoint, the recording, and I'll also send out any of the documents that I referenced. So just wanted to go over that in the beginning. I also mentioned it at the end because I know some folks are just coming in now. But again, wanted to just thank you all for joining me today to go over how to assist homeless students to access higher education. For those of you that know me, welcome back. For those of you that don't know me, I am Sakia Lee. I'm NAEHCY's Director of Higher Education Initiatives. I am going into my third year with being on the NAEHCY team. I initially joined to lead the higher education initiative. So as we go along, you'll find out a little bit more information about that. And I am a licensed counselor. In addition to that, I have worked with homeless youth on college campuses directly in financial aid at two separate universities for over 10 years. And then prior to that, I also worked as a life skills coordinator for homeless students at a shelter. So for the last 15 years now, I've been working with this population of students that we serve. So let's go ahead and get started. Going over some housekeeping items. Some of you have used GoTo training before, some of you, or GoTo meetings, some of you have not. So you can actually hide the control panel, or you can have it out if you need to say anything to me. So if you see this red arrow at the top of the right-hand side of the screen, you can go ahead and click on that to hide the control panel so you're able to see the screen a little bit more. I think I actually need to hide mine right now. And if you need to bring it back out to ask a question, hit the same red button to show your control panel and then type in the question. So we'll take the questions at the end. I'll make sure I leave a good maybe 10, 12 minutes open for that. I'm going to cover a lot of information, but again, you can follow up with me for questions, or you can type them in. I'm going to check one really quickly. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and continue with the PowerPoint. So the first thing I want to do is cover some of the data on homeless youth that experience, or children and youth that experience homelessness. This data that we have comes from the Department of Education. The latest data that we have is for the 12-13 school year, so we're waiting to receive the 13-14 information, but that's pretty standard that we wouldn't have that at this time. But during the academic year, we had 1.2 million homeless children and youth that were enrolled in the public schools experience homelessness, and those on the homeless education end, because we do have some higher ed folks and some service providers, we know that these numbers are largely underreported because not everybody comes forward and said that they're homeless. So it continues to increase every single year that I've been involved with working with homeless students. It's been an 85% increase since the recession. My team and I, we get questions all the time, did the recession play into our children and youth experiencing homelessness? And most certainly some families have not bounced back, but for some others, they were already living in poverty, and unfortunately this is a cycle or way of life for them. So for the 12-13 year, this was the first time the data was extracted to look at unaccompanied homeless youth specifically. So I just want to point these numbers out because when we look at homeless youth in higher education, those numbers start to dwindle. So look at the 75,000, we'll kind of see where we end up. And then they were also able to extract data on one of the fastest growing populations of homeless individuals, and that's the 3 to 5 year olds that I refer to as the babies. So Just wanted to go over some of that preliminary data. So now we'll get into homeless youth in higher education access and look at those numbers. So we do have data for the last couple academic years. For the 12-13 year, we were able to see that around 58,000 unaccompanied homeless youth self-identified on the FAFSA, and we'll go over what those questions look like. Then for the 13-14 academic year, we had a slight decrease of around almost 2,000 students. So we're really not sure why the numbers went down. We don't know if these students just didn't access higher education, if they went on to serve in the military or to do something else, but I'd never like to see those numbers go down. So we are still waiting on the data for the 14-15 year, and we'll see if that changes at all. Now, most of you already know this, but again, because we have a variety of folks on the webinar today, I just want to quickly go over the eligibility for McKinney-Vento rights and services. And just know that I'm only pointing this out because the definitions stay the same when we look at higher education access. McKinney-Vento services don't cross over to higher education, like in terms of transportation, that kind of stuff, but actually looking at who fits the definition, we use the exact same one. So we're looking at those that lack fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, including sharing the housing of others. We actually call this doubled up. This is where you'll find the vast majority of our students that are having an economic hardship and they have to go off and live with someone else. Living in hotels, motels, trailer parks, campgrounds due to the lack of adequate alternative accommodations. So every day on our helpline, which I will give you the number to, I talk to students in these situations. Living in emergency or transitional shelters. So there are not a ton of transitional shelters for homeless youth out there, but we certainly do see some of them. Awaiting the foster care placement. The thing I want to point out is this varies from state to state. So it may be a year of awaiting a foster care placement in your state. It may be 6 months. It may be 90 days, 2 months. Just pointing out that make sure you know what that looks like in your state just when you go to make determinations. Also, those living in public or private places not designed for humans to live. I talk to students that are living in tents. I'm in Michigan, so we have students in the Upper Peninsula that are actually living in tents. I've spoke to students before that have lived in ditches, under bleachers on college campuses. So just every day I find out something new. Students living in trees, every day I find out something new. It really baffles my mind. Of course, living in cars, parks, abandoned buildings, any substandard housing, any migratory children living in above circumstances. So one of the things I've been learning the last couple of years is we have large farming communities in some states, and so families may migrate during that farming season, and sometimes those families are split up. That's just an example of that, and any unaccompanied youth living in the above circumstances. So while I went over this very quickly, because again, a lot of us already know it, some of us may be new to it, but the National Center for Homeless Education has a determining eligibility brief that you can access from their website or our website, which goes over these in greater detail. If you haven't checked that out, I would encourage you to do so. Next, we'll kind of get into fixed, regular, and adequate because that can kind of be a gray area. As we look at higher education, there's a lot of gray area, but so one of the things that we want to do is define the fixed, regular, and adequate. So that basically means, can the student go to the same place? It's stationary, it's permanent, it's not going to change every night, which is regular and predictable, and it's safe and sufficient space. So it's adequate to meet both the physical and the psychological needs. Because sometimes when we talk about families living in a camping ground or a mobile home, we're of course not just talking about, sometimes that can be sufficient, and sometimes in those situations it could not be. So you want to look at all three of those, examine the situation a little bit more, communicate with the student and our family to find out more about those situations that they're living in. Next, I want to talk to you a little bit about paths to being on their own. Really, how do our homeless youth get there? When working directly with folks in higher education, and certainly not to pick on them, a lot of times we want to find out more, or we want to figure out if this was something that the student did to cause some kind of rift in the home. And a lot of times, young adults are not going to leave a home where there's a safe bed, there's sufficient there's lights, gas, food, etc. So there may be some underlying cause, or typically some underlying cause. So a lot of times there's family conflict, there's blended family issues. I've talked to a lot of students whose parents were divorced or separated, and then they've started dating and connecting with other people or remarried, and they're just was discontent in the home. We still see a lot of teens that become pregnant or get someone pregnant. Sexual activity orientation growing one. Over the last maybe 3 or 4 years, I can tell you I've seen a lot of students that were asked to leave the home based on their sexual orientation. At the same time, their religious choices as well. I've seen some students asked to leave. School problems, substance abuse, and I've learned also over the years that when there are trends with states that have laws that are a little bit more lenient in terms of drug use or growing, etc., that sometimes our youth and our families flock to those states and then become homeless. So I just want to point that out. Abuse or neglect within the home, we see about 50 to 70% of our students leaving the home because of some form of abuse and neglect. Then parental incarceration, illness, hospitalization, or death. Of course, I don't have to explain all of those. I'd just like to point out that sometimes when a student only has one parent and they're in this type of situation, it just already knocks them down even more. If they only had just mom there and then she's hospitalized, they really don't have any other support systems in place. So some of these situations can be even more difficult for our students. And lack of space in temporary situations or shelter policies that prohibit adolescent boys from being there. So we have certainly seen some shelter policies that will break families up. So men and young boys over a certain age are not allowed to be there. And I tell people all the time that some of our parents are really great parents. They end up in situations they couldn't control, and sometimes because of rules, they're even separated even more, and that's how our students come to being on their own. We also see a high correlation between the foster care system and homeless students, and a lot of times when we partner for legislation or some of our state networks that I'll get into in a moment, we work with the foster care system and their staff, because we start to see students that are foster homeless. I have actually seen students that have been in 100 different placements. So by the time they get to college, they no longer want to be systemized. They no longer want to identify with being, in the foster care, or they want to just go off and be on their own, and unfortunately they don't always have the skill set to be able to do so. That's why you'll see the age range changing to support foster youth across the country. So there is a high correlation there. So why the broad definition? Because of course you can see that a student can be deemed homeless for an array of reasons. So shelters are often full and turn youth away. They're not always shelters in some areas. Sometimes I will have students call me on the helpline and I'll say, well, let me find a shelter for you in this particular city or town. And it's either so big, um, and there are not a lot of them there, or there's none. I mean, some states there are only two in the state, and they may only have 4 to 8 beds, so it's pretty hard sometimes to find shelter. Or some of the eligibility rules often exclude unaccompanied minors, so sometimes people are still saying we still need parental consent. We'll let you stay here tonight, but you have to have consent from someone. We really don't want our youth in adult shelters. A lot of times that's the only thing I can find for someone, and it's really terrifying to put a young person somewhere where they're with adults that are twice their age that can expose them to a lot of things. Shelters have time limits. Youth are often aware of the alternatives, and really shelters are the last resort. And I've worked at one of the best shelters, but at the end of the day, it's still very much a shelter. It's not really private. It's still public. You'll still have people walking and passing. You have workers. Like, it never really truly feels like your own. So a lot of our youth really don't want to be there. Next, we'll look at homeless youth and higher education. So when we look at unaccompanied homeless youth and higher education access, it is really a two-step process. So one, we have to look at, does the student meet, or are they living in one of those situations previously described that is defined under the McKinney-Vento Act? And once the homelessness is determined, is the student unaccompanied or not? And so I want to take a moment to talk about this word unaccompanied, because in the recent weeks we've had a lot of questions around this. So unaccompanied the textbook definition here that the Department of Ed is using is not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. We know a lot of times our college students will go off and they won't be in the physical custody, but meaning they're not going to be returning to the parents, they're not being supported by the parents, there's no communication, there's a break in communication. So just beyond physical custody, are they being supported? Is there communication? Are they going home to the parents? I've seen some students that will call and say, well, I'm homeless during the week, but on the weekend I can go home. And so that's really not the population of students we're talking about. We're talking about those students that do not have the ability to go home. They don't know where their parents are, or again, there's some break in communication or something preventing them from being home. So I just wanted to stress that. Next, I want to talk to you a little bit about the barriers to higher education access, and this may look different in your state, and this is just a sample of them, and then I'll give you some from our higher education helpline. But in terms of accessing financial aid or completing college forms, or even just having someone to do laundry or buy school books, etc., our students don't have that parental financial information or support. So again, that speaks back to me talking about being unaccompanied. Lack of financial means to live independently and safely. I see students all the time that can do either or. They can live independently, but it's certainly not safe. I've talked to some students that really just, they're living with 15 people, cats and dogs and other animals. There's drug use, abuse, sales going on. There's crime, just a lot of things going on in the place where they're at, but that's the only chance they have to live independently. So. Inability to be financially self-sufficient once enrolled in college. So a lot of times people will think, well, oh, you've got to college, you've made it, or you get this wonderful refund check twice a year, it's $3,000 each time, you should be fine. But our students, they don't necessarily have those budgeting skills. Sometimes it's the first time they've ever had money like that, or they're trying to take care of other siblings or even parents with that funding, so they're not always financially self-sufficient. Limited housing options in areas. So again, the small towns, rural areas, even in some college towns, the housing options may be limited or it may cost too much. I've seen some places where students are like, oh, well, it's $2,000 a month. Like that is ridiculous to have to pay for somewhere to live over the course of an academic year, and so our students may not be able to access them. Struggling to balance school and other responsibilities. We see this a lot. I mean, sometimes our homeless students, they're the valedictorian, they're very bright. It's just they may have some trauma, some depression, some mental illness, even guilt or shame for leaving younger siblings behind, and they struggle to balance that, and they may feel guilty and decide to go back or stop out and drop out. So we absolutely see that a lot. Lack of adult guidance and support. I can tell you on the K through 12 end, you can walk up and down the halls and get the assistance that you need. You can communicate with the teacher. It's a little bit different on a college campus. So a lot of times we'll have students say, I don't know who to talk to. I don't even know what support systems are available on my campus. So those are some of the barriers that we see. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I answer our helpline calls. And so these are the top 6 barriers that we see from there. The one thing that has not gone away that I'm just waiting for the day that it does is getting a determination of their homeless status. And so in a moment, I'll talk to you about a Dear Colleague letter that I thought would make all of this easier, but every single day, the month of September, I've had a conversation with some student that is struggling to get a determination of their homeless status. And no worries, we're working with the folks in higher education for that. And sometimes it's actually the student was never identified in the K through 12, and it's nobody's fault, but they just never got a determination. Students are asking for community referrals. So again, they need somewhere to sleep, they need food and clothing, social services, that type of thing. Obtaining ACT and SAT and admissions fee waivers, so I'll go over that a little bit for you so you'll have some tools to assist students there. Access to higher education housing. So around Halloween or in October is actually when I start to get the calls and the most saying, hey, I know Thanksgiving is coming. I know Christmas is coming. That winter break, I am not going to have anywhere to stay. Can you please help me find somewhere to stay year round or in between breaks? And so that's another battle that we fight with colleges. Then FAFSA completion. So in January, that's typically January and February what we'll be dealing with. And sometimes in April when our students do it late. And then assistance finding scholarships. So of course we have a NAEHCY scholarship, but I'll also give you some other scholarship websites that can be resources for your students. So when we look at financial aid and the FAFSA basics, and I'll try not to stay on the financial aid stuff too long, but the expected family contribution, the EFC that determines how much a family or student must contribute, comes from the tax information that's put on the FAFSA, right? So I always tell my 9 nephews and all my other students that call me, when it's Happy New Year time, it's absolutely happy FAFSA time. We have to get the FAFSA done early. Sometimes taxes are not done then. It doesn't really matter. Students can estimate or they can go back in and change that later, but we want our homeless students to make sure that they start to do that early. Now, I realize that they may not all have access to a computer at that date. That's when I encourage you to think about what you can do to welcome them back to school and have some FAFSA completion, or to have conversations with them before break to think about where they can get this completed. So for our dependent students, they have to add parental information. For our independent students, they do not have to add parental information. I realize this is tiny print, and I believe we have a PDF version of the FAFSA on our website, but you can get it at www.fasfa.ed.gov or just fasfa.gov. But basically, this goes over all of the independent status questions. Now, I won't go into all of them, but this is a sample FAFSA from the 2013-14 academic year. You'll see questions 56, 57, and 58 specifically ask about our homeless students being identified by the school district liaison, a housing and urban development designee, or a Runaway and Homeless Youth Act designee. So those are the 3 questions there. The online FAFSA, which we encourage our students to complete, will then ask the question the paper FAFSA will not. So a lot of times I still see our homeless students doing the paper FAFSA when, again, I encourage them to do the online FAFSA. But it will ask them, are you homeless and are you unaccompanied? Do you still meet these definitions, but you did not receive a determination by anybody else? I want to take a moment to tell you that if you are working with students and it's FAFSA time, please encourage them to make sure they answer the questions correctly at the beginning. When they start to complete it. I see sometimes students will go back and try to find parents, or they'll add grandma stuff or an aunt, or it's just some adults, and it's really not necessary, but they may not know that. So if they just answer these questions, they don't have to add financial information that can be considered conflicting later. So just want to point that out. Now I want to talk to you about unaccompanied homeless youth and the IRS, because in April we get a lot of questions in, or even around FAFSA time, that we have these students, we know that they're homeless, but what if parents still claim them on the tax return? So the definitions of dependent and independent for the purposes of FAFSA are not the same as the IRS. So the IRS, for example, and I believe it's the IRS publication 17, it will say that if a student lived in a home for 6 months or was supported by the parents, they could claim them on the taxes. So when the student fills out the FAFSA, they want to just stick to those FAFSA definitions from the Department of Education that asks them about being independent or dependent. So in terms of the parents may still claim them and the student doesn't know, because they could have had the right to claim them if the student was there for 6 months. Sometimes the student's been long gone, but we really don't want to be, we really don't want our students to have to like call parents and say, well, did you claim me? Did you not claim me? They should just stick to the questions on the FAFSA. So this is covered more in depth in our higher education toolkit. I put the link there. I'm certainly open to take questions about it, but I just don't want students or your students to think that if they are claimed by their parents, that will hinder them. Again, they should be answering the questions about themselves, about being independent, about meeting those definitions, being unaccompanied homeless youth. It is considered tax fraud if people are claiming folks that they did not take care of, but it's very rare that students will want to turn their parents into the IRS. So that's all I'll say on that for right now. Next, I want to talk to you about the College Cost Reduction and Access Act that came out towards the end of around 2007. And basically what it did is it identified these 4 folks that can make a determination of a student's unaccompanied homeless status. So the local McKinney-Vento liaison, the RHOIA funded shelter director or designee, the HUD funded shelter director or designee, and last but not least, the financial aid administrator. So no one person has more clout than the other. Students should not be ping-ponged around from one to the other to get a determination, because financial aid administrators have the ability to do so. I'm providing the links to 2 different templates on our website that can be used by any of the four verifiers or specifically financial aid administrators. The one thing I will say is we update this each academic year, but I will see liaisons that fill out the template and it may say like 2009 on it. So just make sure that if your school district is using a template that it's updated every academic year to say that the student was identified as being homeless as after July 1 of the previous year. So some schools will still take it, some schools will reject it. If the student has left your district, please don't continue to fill out one of these every year. After they left your school district, the financial aid administrator should be making the subsequent year determinations for them if they've not been to one of the shelters. So now I want to talk to you about the application and verification guide, and this guidance, as well as a Dear Colleague letter, I put in the materials section for this webinar. I put them there at 1 o'clock today, so I imagine most of you don't have them, but again, I'll send this information out to you. But the application and verification guide from the Federal Student Aid Handbook is what financial aid administrators use to administer financial aid, to disperse financial aid, to award financial aid. So the AVG borrows language from the National Center for Homeless Education's Determining Eligibility Brief. Again, same language. It says that a homeless youth status determination is not considered a case of professional judgment. Many moons ago, it was a case of professional judgment to say, are you not living at home? Why are you not living at home? I need a little bit more information, and then as a professional, I can decide if you meet the definition or if you don't. And so it's no longer like that. It's also not conflicting information if the financial aid administrator disagrees with an authority's determination. Now, I can tell you, if they find that they think there's some abuse by the McKinney-Vento liaison, which we have these conversations rarely, but they are encouraged to contact the state coordinator in those situations. But generally, they're just supposed to accept it. So, and we want liaisons to be making the right determinations at the right time. And so they're just supposed to accept it. But if there is if they do think that there's any form of abuse, and the AVG says that, and even by the shelter director, by anybody, there's an oversight party for each. So institutions are not required to verify answers to homeless youth status questions unless there's conflicting information. So this goes back to me saying that we want the students to complete the FAFSA the right way the first time. I talked to so many students that are like, well, I did go and search 4 hours and find my mother in the middle of the night because I thought that's what I had to do. And so once we have mom's name, social, date of birth, all that information on the form, it's very hard to say, oh, but that was a mistake. So we just want to make sure there's no conflicting information. All of that has to be resolved before the student can receive aid. It can hinder them from receiving aid. And now a student can use an address where they can receive reliable mail. So before, some schools would say, oh, we see an address on your FAFSA. How do you have an address and you're homeless? But now they can actually put down an address where they can receive reliable mail, or they can ask the campus for permission to receive mail on campus at, say, the financial aid office, the counseling office, somewhere where they'll have access, but they need to just make sure they ask that office first. Next, I want to talk to you about the U.S. Department of Education's Dear Colleague letter that was issued on July 29th. So what that did was it clarifies institutional and applicants' roles and responsibilities for applying for financial aid as unaccompanied homeless youth. It brings awareness that institutions are unnecessarily restricting aid applications and focusing on why the student is homeless, why they're not in their home, why they're not communicating with the parents, as opposed to the actual evidence that the student is unaccompanied homeless youth are self-supporting, and not just simply self-supporting, but a self-supporting student facing the risk of being homeless. So I was really happy to see this come out, because I always tell financial aid administrators or any folks in higher ed that from the stories that I hear that I can't get out of my mind from students telling me what people have done to them, like one, you really don't want to hear it. Two, you really don't need to know if somebody was raped or molested every single night for 2 years. You don't need that information to determine that currently they're unaccompanied homeless youth and they're lacking fixed, regular, adequate housing. So sometimes it may just be as simple as that I had to flee the home because of some abuse, and we'll leave it at that. But it also indicates that applicants under the age of 24, because you can only be considered independent by being 24. But now students that are 22 and 23 who are either unaccompanied homeless youth or self-supporting and facing the risk of homelessness now qualify for a homeless youth determination. The FAFSA language and this U.S. Dear Colleague letter language still need to catch up to each other. So, well, right now, our policy director, Barbara Duffield, she has submitted some comments to change the FAFSA language, and we will be asking different folks to sign on because we don't want it to be conflicting. We want to make sure that our 22 and our 23-year-olds, if they meet the definition, they no longer have to complete a dependency override. So in the years to come, we'll probably actually see these homeless status numbers double because we'll have more students that will meet the definition. Maybe not double, but certainly increase. So now I want to get into best practices for access and retention and success in college, and then we will have some questions. So we're nearing the home stretch. One of the things I want to talk to you about is choosing a school, because a lot of times students will call me. I just had a young lady call me yesterday. She was 15. She graduated high school. And I kept checking, like, you sure you graduated high school? But she graduated high school and she had no clue what she wanted to do next. So a lot of times I'll point students to the student aid .ed.gov website so they can look at what school they want to choose. If they want to choose a 2-year institution, they want to choose a 4-year institution, or vocational or technical school. We support students in all of these situations. We fight hard and advocate for them in all these situations, but a lot of times students, they have no clue where to go. College may have never entered their mind, so this is a really great tool. And remember, again, you'll get the recording and you'll get this PowerPoint so you can actually check out this website and look. There's another college search tool that I encourage students to look at, and also practitioners that work kind of one-on-one with students when they're choosing a school. So it's the College Navigator. And what that does is it goes over the general school information, tuition and fees. I can't tell you how many students call me when they have a $10,000 balance, when they have a $30,000 balance, and it's like, did anybody talk to you about the tuition before you got to the school? So we have to look at those type of things, the type of financial aid provided, the net price, the enrollment. Is it a large school? Is it a small school? The admissions requirements, are they waiving the ACT and SAT tests, because a lot of schools are starting to do that? Or is there some other aptitude test that you have to meet at the school? The retention and graduation rates, I've worked at colleges before where those were actually low, and so sometimes that isn't always where we want to send our students. The accreditation, really big. I see a lot of college access commercials that come on late at night with catchy jingles and songs, and you know, they reach out to students like, oh, I know I could go to that online school. Not that online schools are bad, but it may not be a school that has accreditation, or it may only be accredited in that state or that region. So if someone takes the time to become, say, a chef, and they want to get a job somewhere else, those credentials may not even matter outside of that state. So our students don't actually think about that, but that's something that I'd like for you all to have the conversation with them about, or connect them to this tool if that's really not your role. So campus security statistics, all colleges have to report on the level of crime. So that's something that we want our students to be reviewing. And the default rate. So again, with the student loans, do we want to send our students somewhere knowing that they may be preyed upon to borrow and there is a high rate of default? So our students, they don't think about those things, and sometimes as professionals we may not either, but this is a really great tool that goes over all of that. I want to also talk to you about the admissions requirements. So we want our students to know the admission requirements for that college. Can they get in with the GED? Is it strictly on GPA? Again, do they need those ACT or SAT scores? We want them to adhere to application deadlines for the desired semester. I talk to so many students that call me like 24 hours before the deadline, and I realize our students, they live in crisis, and so sometimes that's just how they operate, but it takes us as professionals to work with them to say, hey, have you thought about college? You know the applications come out in October, and you need to have them in by February or April or something like that. But it's just really good to plant those seeds and have those conversations. Make sure they have a waiver for application fee. or they talk to a college about the application fee if they're not able to pay it. So sometimes I'll see students, yeah, I submitted the application, but then there is a hold on their account because they didn't have the $40 fee waiver. Sometimes they also need to submit essays or a transcript. Another thing, a lot of times just students will just do one part, but not all of the parts. So it helps to either create a checklist or just say to students, write down every single thing that you need for you to be able to go to Alabama A&M, and let's just make sure that you've done everything. Most of the time the colleges will have a checklist on their website or in the students portal, so they just should stay in tune with that. So. And ask about alternative programs if the student doesn't meet the general requirements. So sometimes there may be a bridge program. There may be a cohort program where if they didn't have the right GPA or SAT or whatnot, they can still get in, but they have to take a set of classes with a set number of students. So those programs are actually phenomenal, but just check to see, because sometimes a student will have their heart set on something and they don't ask about those programs when they could have had the opportunity to actually get in. I'll briefly talk to you about fee waivers, and you'll see the list of all of them that we have here. So we have a lot of our homeless students that take AP courses. So the College Board has the AP exam fee waiver. They also have the SAT fee waiver and the College Board application fee waiver. So that is an application fee that they can use for the admissions. However, not every single college accepts that. You'll see the ACT fee waiver is there, and then the NAEHCY fee waiver. So the NAEHCY fee waiver is also used for admissions. All of these fee waivers are discussed in greater detail in our toolkit. The one thing that I'll point out is that a lot of times if a student receives free and reduced lunch, or if they're classified as being unaccompanied homeless youth and they get one fee waiver, sometimes the college will say, well, did you get the SAT fee waiver? Did you get the ACT fee waiver, AP exam? Well, we'll go ahead and waive your admission status sometimes, not all the time, but if a student is receiving free or reduced lunch or classified as being homeless, and that may be able to be used on the higher education end. I'd like for you to check with your college for housing, or have the student check with their college for housing, tuition deposit, and admissions fee waiver. So I know I already mentioned the NAEHCY and the College Board. Some colleges just do not participate in that. So I've had to reach out to colleges and say, hey, I have this unaccompanied homeless student. Can you please make sure that their fees are waived? Or I will have people calling the helpline like, well, this student signed up for the dorms, but they don't have that $250. So just because a student is homeless does not automatically waive the housing deposit. But if you can communicate and sometimes send over that verification letter, officers will have a change of heart, or they'll be able to waive or defer the fee waivers until the financial aid is dispersed. But please don't think that these are automatic. These are things that students have to work on. All right, so now I want to talk to you about what we like to see on college campuses for our students. So, and for the sake of time, I'm going to breeze through this a little quicker so we can keep it open for questions. But we want every student to have campus supports, right? So all of them that you see here: financial aid, academic support, residence life, counseling services, etc. Then we have our homeless and our foster youth that sometimes they need to be connected to the Department of Health and Human Services. They need the education training voucher, which is specifically for foster care students that were in foster care after their 14th birthday. They need shelter, they need public assistance, they need medical insurance. And so we have students operating in two different systems that never communicate with each other. Through our statewide networks and through our higher education initiative, we try to have the two systems communicating and talking to each other, not just heavy on the college side, not just heavy on the services side, but actually communicating with the folks, the partners in your state, so you can streamline access, college access and support for students. As I mentioned, we do this through our networks, and so what we do with the networks is convene a meeting with local stakeholders from the K through 12 system, foster care, higher ed, those shelter staff. We allow everybody to share their knowledge area of expertise. We talk about unaccompanied homeless youth definitions, of course, financial aid because they have the money, campus and community resources, what's available on campus, what's available off campus. Then we work with that state to build or support an action plan that exists for serving unaccompanied homeless youth that makes sense for that community. So for example, we're working with Montana, and we are working with Florida. So the resources available and needed, some of them are the same in those two states, and some of them are very different based on rural areas or based on tuition waivers that already exist in the state. So we don't try to come in at NAEHCY with our own plan. We really work to see what's there and what's the best fit. You'll see here all of the states that have networks, and I won't read them all off to you because I always say reading is fundamental. But I like to just point out a couple of them. So Colorado, as you can see in the established section, is really our blueprint state. So they got started with the statewide networks first around 2010 or 2011, and they really kind of wrote the template for what statewide networks look like. And then North Carolina, New Hampshire, and Kentucky came on afterwards. And then once I joined NAEHCY, then we started to bring on all of these other networks. Each year I work to bring on 3 states at a time, because if you try to do more than that, it just gets a little bit crazy. But this year we're working with California, Pennsylvania. They're kind of well on their way with their network. And then Maryland will have their first meeting October 6th or 7th. And then some of their plans they're still waiting to go live, but you can find out more information about our statewide networks on our website. We'll continue to fill in different announcements and initiatives from the networks. I just spoke to the folks in New Hampshire today and found out they had a really nice kind of packet of information they put together for their state and for students to be able to access campus contacts, which I'll talk about in a minute. But if you do not see your state up here, it does not mean that I did not talk to your state coordinator, and not to put it all on them, but we need everybody at the table for these kind of conversations. So if you're interested in having a statewide network for 2016, I'm going to move to an RFP process, but I'm still very interested in having a network in every single state, or improving or expanding upon what already exists in the states that are here. And the RFP will be, that information will be on our website come early 2016. So now, from the networks, we establish single points of contact for homeless youth, and we call those a SPOC. And so what that SPOC is a supportive college administrator on campus who's committed to helping homeless youth, and in some places foster youth, also, for example, Georgia, to successfully navigate the college going process. So for retention, for mentor support, for breaks, housing in between breaks, all of those things. Now, our SPOCs don't have to come from the financial aid office. A lot of times they're found there. They could be in the counseling office because that may be a better fit. Dean of students, student support services, so it varies. So a lot of times I'll have people asking, like, can I be a SPOC? You most certainly can. We have a SPOC model. It's available on our website, or I could send that to you, but it doesn't have to be from one of these offices. And so to expand upon that, there's our little picture of Mr. Spock, but they can come from any office, and they help students with admissions, financial aid, academic advising, tutoring, student life, all of these services here. So it really works well. We have the Spocks in New Hampshire, North Carolina, Colorado, Georgia, Michigan. We have a sprinkle of them in some of the other states. Massachusetts, they're working on their SPOC initiative now. The thing I want to point out is we don't have SPOCs everywhere. So I'll pick on Minnesota right now. Nothing special, not to be picking on you, but just as an example, I may have someone call me from Minnesota and say, I need to know who the SPOCs are in Minnesota. And I have no clue. One, because we don't have a network there. There may be something going on, but it isn't a formal initiative that we're folded into. So if you know about something going on in your state, if there's something going on in a state that was not listed, please do let me know, because when I get students calling in from that state, or if I get liaisons calling in from that state, we'd like to know about the information, but right now we do not have SPOCs on every college campus. There are 7,000 campuses. We do not have 7,000 SPOCs, but in the higher education language that we have written, and we are going to be forwarding for support in our recommendation, we are recommending that colleges have SPOCs. It just, that law hasn't passed just yet. So some best practices for high school. So we want you to focus on FAFSA completion. Studies have shown that 80% of students that complete the FAFSA go off to access higher education within about 18 months. So we encourage you to have a FAFSA week, a FAFSA day. Invite your college campuses in the area out to come and do the FAFSA. They may know how to do it a little bit better than you, but we do have FAFSA week information on our website. Make sure your high school counselors know about the FAFSA policies for unaccompanied homeless youth. I will be working with I've worked with school counselors associations nationally and national college access networks. I'm about to hit all of the major higher education conferences to make sure I talk about this population of students and how those college access support can help them. But communicate with the folks in your state and in your area. Arrange for students to visit local colleges and universities. I can tell you from being a first generation student myself that the first college I went to visit in 7th grade is the college that I ended up going to 5 years later, and that was because I enjoyed the campus, and that was really my first opportunity to view a college. So I hear that from our homeless students all the time. Like once they get on a college campus, they're like, yes, I can see I deserve to be there. So use our template when making determinations that I mentioned before, and then connect with Upward Bound, Gear Up, TRIO, all those college access and bridge programs in your state. For those of you that may be here on participating from a college campus, we ask you to coordinate services between financial aid, student support services, campus housing where it exists, open a food and clothing bank if you can. We actually have some best practices to share from people who have implemented food banks, and I can connect you to some wonderful spots from across the country. Consider the housing options. Can a residence hall be left open for students? Are they allowed to stay in the international dorms? Are there host homes in the area where students can be? And if your campus does not have a spot, and the name varies. Some places it's a designated point of contact, it's a campus angel, it's a whatever, but we want those single points of people that can help our homeless students. So if you don't have one, please consider implementing one on your campus. And then for both parties, think about some of the other resources that you can connect students to. So state health insurance, those plans vary across states. Some students may need Social Security income, some of them may need TANF or SNAP, or you may need to connect them to shelters. The one thing I did when I worked in financial aid was I just started to get my own list of what services were available in Michigan so I would know for myself, and if I had a student, again, I wouldn't have to ping pong them around. I could say, you know what, the SNAP office or the link to find them in our state is here, so make sure you get connected. Just something as simple as that. And then the Administration for Children and Families, this is my go-to site to find shelters for students. So a lot of times I'll have students call me from across the country and I have no clue where to find a shelter in Cleveland, Mississippi, but this website helps to guide me. So talk to you about our NAEHCY scholarship. So for many of you that have been to our conference, you know that we have a scholarship, and it was formerly known as the Laton Scholarship, but now it's just a NAEHCY scholarship. We offer this to about 15 students each academic year, and we invite them out to our conference. So we did choose the scholars for this academic year. So if you're at the conference, you will see them. And the new application will be out in January of 2016, but basically they have to do a short essay, complete the form, have a letter of recommendation, and have their high school transcripts. So it is always a joy to meet those scholars and to read those applications. Other scholarship resources. So a lot of times students will call in and say, I'm homeless, well, what scholarships can I apply for? So nationally, there are only 2 scholarships for homeless students, a Horatio Alger's, which students have to apply for in high school, and the information's there, and ours. There may be some state or regional or some scholarships at an actual college, but nationally there's not a lot. So students have to apply for scholarships that are based on their academic talents, merits, and other abilities. And that's when I turn to FastWeb, where students can actually create an account and they will email them scholarships. College Board the same way. I walked even some of our NAEHCY scholars through this process so they could find more scholarships. And then the U.S. Department of Labor. So really good websites, but it's going to take some searching. I always tell students you need to apply for at least 100 scholarships. It may sound like a lot, but if you are helping them make the time while they're in school, have like a scholarship lab or scholarship day, because they may not be able to do it anywhere else. Just want to point that out because they're not guaranteed a free tuition, free college based on their homeless status. Next, I want to talk to you about a new resource for our NAEHCY members. So even this webinar is being offered to you as a NAEHCY member, even though we may have some folks that are not members on, but use your membership for all that it's worth, right? So we partnered with Inceptia, which is a branch of the National Student Loan Program, and they are giving us access to Financial Avenue. And so Financial Avenue is a free financial literacy source. I've gone through the demos, I've taken some of the tests, and I think it's really great. It's a web-based program that are for students that are like 16 to 33, so a wide range. It goes over, how to access college, but also credit cards and bank accounts and savings, like things that no one really talks to our particular students about. So anyone in our statewide networks can use this tool with the students they serve. Our local task forces, again, our NAEHCY scholars are using this as members. You now will see the link to our page and you'll have our access code. On October 5th at 2 p.m., we're going to actually have the folks from Inceptia go over how to use this tool, because I'm a little tech savvy, but not a lot tech savvy. So they're going to go over some demos. There are some student videos where students will talk about, yeah, I defaulted on this loan, and that's not what you want to do. It's just really friendly student language. So I encourage you to join that webinar. We only have 50 people signed up right now. And since January, we've only had 16 people sign up for Financial Avenue. There has to be more people that want their homeless students to have access to financial literacy courses. I can tell you, I talk to students all the time that at 18, 19, 20, they just don't get it. And so you can have your students learning about that early on. Some of our resources I've already mentioned: our College Access and Success Toolkit. We have Unaccompanied Homeless Youth Toolkits, FAFSA toolkits. Every month we do a different podcast for our podcast series, and so I think there are actually maybe 17 of them up there now, but the podcasts are 3-minute snippets on higher education topics. And they're really good. They change all the time, and we'll have some coming up on like how to connect with community partners. We'll do one on suicide prevention for suicide, National Suicide Awareness Month. So a lot of different college access topics or things that impact our homeless youth on college campuses. We have our FAFSA tips for unaccompanied homeless youth without stable housing, and we have our unaccompanied homeless youth access college brief. So that will conclude the webinar. I'm hoping that my computer does not start to act all crazy, but I'm going to go to see if we have any questions. If you do, this would certainly be the time to go ahead and ask them. I think we just have one, which is, I'll answer that in just a moment. But again, remember that you will get the copy of this recording. You'll actually get the PowerPoint itself. You'll get the Dear Colleague letter, the application and verification guide, and again, do call me or email me and just let me know if you have any questions. So one question is, what organizations can provide homeless certifications for students, especially for non-traditional students? So in terms of who can make a determination, it's the McKinney-Vento liaison, the RHYA and HUD shelter directors, the financial aid administrators. But if, and the AVG goes over this, if there is a clergy, a social worker, a mental health practitioner, someone who has knowledge that a student was homeless, they can write a letter of support, but the actual determination has to come from one of those four. So, but again, the AVG and both the Dear Colleague letter go over a more extensive list, like a TRIO counselor, a college access advisor. I mean, if they have knowledge, then they can provide a letter of support, but it's only those four. So let's see if there are any other questions. And thank you all for joining me today. I'm seeing a lot of things come in, so thank you all for joining me again during this busy time of the year. So if you have to leave, leave, but I'm going to continue to read the questions, and again, you'll get all of this. Let's see this question that just came in. If you are designated homeless by one college financial aid administrator, do you have to go through the same process at another school if you're applying to more than one school, or does the one administrator's designation carry over to all schools? This is a great question. So schools are allowed to accept a determination made by another college during the academic year. This status has to be reviewed every academic year. So if someone had a determination at University of Michigan their freshman year. 2 years later, if they're switching over to Savannah State, it's not gonna fly. However, the financial aid administrator at Savannah State has the ability to make a determination for the student. And if the student kept in contact with, say, a mental health counselor on the first college campus, they can say, for 2 years, I saw Miss Lee about all the trauma, the turmoil, whatever, that while I was homeless, and she has some knowledge, but again, that college financial aid administrator at the next college can make a determination. It won't carry over everywhere. It has to be reviewed each academic year. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but really great question. Anybody else for the good of the order? I don't know if anybody raised this little hand thing over here. Let me check that. Looks like no. All right, well, I will go ahead and conclude the webinar. Do call or email me if you need to. And thank you again for joining me. Please join us on October 5th to learn more about Financial Avenue. Have a great day.